Centre. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow at the Centre with responsibility for developing English language events, programming and output here at the Centre, and that includes public events. That includes public events like this one, and there'll be more of these, so please keep checking our Facebook page and our website. Here at the Begin Centre we are looking to inform and educate about the issues that were the prime motivations and passions of Menachem Begin, primarily Israel's flourishing as a Jewish and democratic state, the connection with the Jewish people and the safety and security of Israel and the Jewish people. And it's very easy here in Israel with so much going on internally with political intrigue and internal security issues for us to focus inward, but necessarily as part of the Middle East we will be impacted by what goes on around us, and that's where we really rely on writers and analysts like Jonathan Spire to keep us informed and make us aware of what's happening in the region, not least, of course, in Syria, which is a couple of hundred miles from where we're sitting, and where there is which has really become the epicenter of global jihadism and Iran's regional ambitions. So I'm really delighted that our first English event of 2018 is the launch of this book by Jonathan Spire, the man who you may have heard single-handedly ended the career of a senior member of President Assad's government. So we will hear from Jonathan. We'll have time for Q&A. We're also going to have another great speaker, Dr. Aaron Lerman, former Deputy National Security Advisor. But I'm going to hand you over first to our MC for the evening, Dr. David Chazoni, who's Executive Director of the Israel Innovation Fund, which is a new cultural non-profit based in Tel Aviv. His past positions include Vice President for Development at the Shalem Center, Managing Director of the Israel Project, and Editor-in-Chief of Azure and later the Tower. He has a PhD from Hebrew University in Jewish philosophy and has authored, edited, or translated a number of volumes of Jewish and Zionist thought. So without further ado, David, please.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for coming out tonight. It is the kind of night that you don't expect to get a good crowd because of the weather, and days and days of the weather have made us all curious about our world in ways that do not require going out into. And I say that for a reason. We live in a time, especially the last few years, I think, and I'm saying this as somebody who lives in Israel now, and I've spent the better part of the last 2 decades in Israel, but I also spent the last 4 years in Washington. And I saw what was happening to the American conversation from very close up. And it's very disturbing. We live in a time when it's harder and harder and harder to figure out what is actually happening in the world, exactly at a moment when we have the greatest access to information that humanity has ever had. We live in a time when people are not just making up falsehoods, but building entire messaging operations and Twitter bots dedicated solely to proliferating those falsehoods. It is really a difficult time for people trying to understand their world and take actions, and political actions, and vote. And it's a time when we most desperately need people who combine the different ways of understanding that have characterized certain major professions, such as journalism and analysis. We have a lot of scholars, and we have a lot of reporters. We live in a time, however, when the ratio of the number of words said to the units of knowledge possessed by people saying words, that ratio has gone up dramatically. Okay? So we do have scholars who are serious people, analysts, who take the time and trouble to learn languages, to study history and to develop deeper understandings of what's going on. And we also have serious journalists who go there. That's the number one criterion for a serious journalist. They go there. They see it with their eyes. They talk to the people on the ground. But it's very, very rare to find somebody who's very good at both. I mean, the number of people you can think of who are really, really top-notch analysts, but also have the courage and the resourcefulness and the drive to make sure they go there and see it themselves is a very small number. In our own time, we think of someone like Bernard-Henri Lévy. We think of, in the past, we think of someone like George Orwell. And Jonathan, I hope you will not. No, you won't. You won't mind if I put you in a category with that.
Henri Lévy.
Okay, fine. No, but seriously, we need that. We need people who are just as much at home scurrying under a fence between the Turkish-Syrian border and getting themselves all covered in mud, and then testifying before Congress about what exactly is going on over there. We need voices that are grounded in knowledge, and then deep in that knowledge with serious understanding of history and a serious understanding of the people and the unique cultures and the many different unique cultures, political and religious and so forth. And that's a rare thing. So I personally feel very honored to have been asked to participate and to help launch this extremely important work, which we're going to talk about today. I was honored to have edited many of Jonathan's works when I was the editor of The Tower. He wrote a number of pieces, and then when he came to town, we got together with the local. You know, DC seems like a big place, but it's actually a very, very small town for any given issue. And the topic of people who write about the Middle East and actually know what they're talking about, that's a very small group of people, and we all know each other, and we know what each other drinks, and we all know Jonathan, and when he comes to town, there's a party, and you know, it's great. And he's equally comfortable in all of these environments. So I hope you'll be comfortable in this environment. And I want to thank you all, and thank the Begin Center, and thank Paul. It's great to see also Dr. Lerman here. After many years I haven't seen you. I was asked to mention that there will be sales of the book taking place at the end of this event. And if you're nice to Jonathan, he will also sign them. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay. And if not, then I will. It won't be worth as much, I promise. Okay, so without further ado, Dr. Jonathan Spire.
Thank you and good evening, and thank you very much for coming out on this difficult night. I do appreciate it a lot. So how we're going to do this is I'm going to talk for about 15 or 20 minutes, and then we are going to move to conversation and questions and answers, and Iran is going to also later on respond, so to speak, from his point of view. His point of view being the implications for Israel and Israeli security of a lot of what we're going to now try to talk about. So, to get straight to it then, what I want to do is talk a little bit about how I see the Syria and Iraqi situation as it has developed and where it's at, and then I'm going to try and explain where the book, Project of Days of the Fall, fits in with that, and then conclude with a few remarks about where things may be going. To get straight to it then, let me first of all say the following. It's clear to all of us that we are 6 or 7 years into a process of very profound convulsion and instability in the Middle East region. The process of instability kicked off, of course, first of all in Tunisia, initially misnamed the Arab Spring, has very clearly, after 7 years, not produced what many thought perhaps it would produce, namely the process whereby authoritarian governments were brought down by popular action and replaced by more representative forms of governance. That clearly hasn't happened. Nevertheless, there is, it would seem to me, 7 years in to a process that's not yet finished, of course, 7 years in, a certain pattern that can be identified, and that is that what is taking place is that as a result of popular action, a whole series of Middle East states of relatively long historic standing are effectively collapsing and ceasing to be, and a kind of conflict or war over the ruins, so to speak, for the most part fought out by political and military organizations, for the most part organized on ethnic or religious, sectarian or sometimes tribal basis, is what is replacing these former centralized states. Now that's happening in a variety of places in the region. That's happened in Yemen, it's happening in Libya, but it's possible, I think, to say that Syria is the kind of epicenter, so to speak, of that process, the place which exemplifies that process most clearly. And as I would characterize it today, at least, that process, combined with a couple of prior existing processes, namely the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, and the long process whereby Iran has been seeking to insert itself, so to speak, into the lives of Arab states in the Levant and Mesopotamian region. As a result of those three processes coming together, there is today, in the very large land area between the Iraq-Iran border and the Mediterranean Sea, no single properly functioning state. No single properly functioning state or government worthy of the name in terms of the basic needs of a state, in the sense of its controlling the monopoly of the means of violence over the area it controls, and so on and so forth. And what has replaced the existence of the formerly very strong, very dictatorial, but very strong state governments that existed is a kind of patchwork of areas of control stretching across the countries in question, and an ongoing, not single conflict, but an ongoing series of conflicts taking place between the various areas of control. We can think, if we take a quick look, so to speak, across that swathe of territory from the Mediterranean Sea to the Iraq-Iran border, we can immediately make out, a number of different areas, and also a number of different types of arrangement that exist within that broader heading of collapsed states and areas of control within them. If we begin in Lebanon, we can see that in Lebanon you have an example of a place that has not collapsed physically. There is still a state, ostensibly. There is still a state government, ostensibly. But what has happened is that the state government and state structures have been effectively swallowed up by a terrorist organisation, the Hezbollah movement, of course, which now effectively maintains a kind of monopoly with regard to its own actions and running its own foreign policy and its own internal policy, without any need whatsoever to consult with the official government, and also very much able to act against the wishes of the official government when it wishes to do so. And if we move across to Syria, we can immediately identify 3 or 4 specific areas of control, and perhaps more. Of course, the area controlled, now about 55% of the territory, controlled by the thing that calls itself the official government of Syria, which we usually refer to as Assad regime. And then, in addition to that, an interesting entity east of the Euphrates River, controlling around 28% of the territory, controlled by the Syrian Kurds and their allies. And then, with the rest of the territory taken up in a kind of patchwork of the areas still controlled by the now collapsing Islamic State, and 3 or 4 areas in the northwest, southwest, and southeast, controlled by the remnants now, I think one is able to say, of the Sunni Arab rebellion that broke out in 2011. And then if we move eastwards once again to look at Iraq, we can see again a country which is not as radically collapsed and fragmented as Syria is, but is nevertheless, I think, clearly separated in a number of interesting ways. First of all, in the northern part of Iraq, there is a people effectively held against their will within Iraq, and that's the Iraqi Kurds, who of course voted overwhelmingly on September 25th of last year for separation, for secession from Iraq, but then forcibly prevented in October by the Iraqi government and its Iranian allies from carrying out that secession. And of course in Baghdad southwards there is the elected Shia Islamist-dominated government of Iraq, and there is the confused Sunni Arab centre of Iraq, officially held within the borders or administered by the central government, but nevertheless containing a population radically alienated, I think it's possible to say, from the very clearly Shia sectarian government of Hyder al-Abadi and his allies that holds power in Baghdad. So that's one patchwork that you can apply, so to speak, over the map of those 3 collapsed states. That's that one contiguous, very large, very central area. To understand the situation, however, it's important also to apply a second lens, so to speak, because there's the lens of those forces we just described, of local forces holding power, Then there's an additional lens you have to put on, which is that of external and regional powers active in that space. It is a fact that none of the entities I just mentioned, with the interesting single exception of the now collapsing Islamic State, none of the entities I mentioned are able to sustain themselves independently. All of them are able to continue in existence because of the support or assistance, or one might well say ownership in some cases, of outside external powers. And indeed the contests between those powers are and understanding the dynamic of those contests is no less crucial rather to grasping what's going on than is having an intricate understanding of the forces on the ground. So which powers would we be talking about? Well, most obviously and most coherently, the power which is active in all three countries is that of Islamic Republic of Iran, pursuing its own very clear and cogent ambition. And indeed, I think it's possible to say that Iran, unlike all the other external powers we can go on to consider in a moment, Iran, in my estimation at least, is the only one of the external powers that's kind of properly grasped what's going on here. In other words, has properly grasped that the state borders between Iraq and Syria and Lebanon to a great extent are fictional today, and that therefore it is required of a state which wishes to properly advance its strategy to see the whole space as a single space, and to build a strategy which goes across the borders. And this is not something which is notional or theoretical. This is something which is very practical if we look at the way, for example, that when Bashar al-Assad gets into trouble because of an absence of sufficient loyal manpower in the year of late 2012, early 2013, it is Iran which is able to mobilize local proxies in Lebanon and in Iraq and bring them into the Syrian space to help a friend in need. And similarly with regard to the issue of Iraq itself, when ISIS is heading towards Baghdad in the summer of 2014, Iran once again is able to mobilize militia allies, including of course Lebanese Hezbollah, to come across to Iraq to help out, to train up militias being mobilized to fight against ISIS. Iran is the only one which is operating across the whole space. But there are other countries, of course, which is supporting, of course, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Assad regime in Syria, and the government of Haider al-Abadi in Iraq, but more importantly, the very large paramilitary mobilization called the Hashd al-Shabi, the Shia militias, 150,000 strong, that are operating effectively independently in that space since the summer of 2014. But there are other powers too, which we need to remember. First of all, and most obviously, the United States of America, which is in the process of developing, I think, a more coherent approach to all this, at least on the theoretical level. I think if one listens to President Trump's speech on December 19th, I think it was, outlining the national security strategy of his administration, he related quite a lot to this stuff, and he relates to it in a pretty coherent way. Iran as the centre of world terrorism and the need to turn back the Iranian project of building proxies. It remains to be seen, I think, whether that quite clear outlining of the problem will in fact translate into practical policy. I think there's a number of problems. If we think of these countries as we should, as a single space, there's a number of problems with US policy. There's an emergent, now declared intention to hold on to eastern Syria with the Kurds and the other allies, with the intention now stated, and this is part of the reason why the Turks are upset and others, now clearly stated, with the intention not just of defeating ISIS, but that ownership of territory should form a part of a larger strategy against Iran and Iranian advancement. But if you turn to look at some of the other countries, and again I reiterate that to my way of thinking at least, you must think of this area as a single space, not as three spaces if you want coherent policy. In the Iraqi context, the United States remains committed to the government of Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi. But Haider al-Abadi, whilst he is by all accounts a nice and convivial man, at least much nicer than his predecessor Nouri al-Maliki, Haider al-Abadi is a member of the Dawa Party, and the Dawa Party is a Shia Islamist party supported by the Iranians. And Abadi himself is a long-time operative of that party. And within his government are members of the Iran-supported Shia militias controlling important ministries, including Qasem al-Araji, who is the Interior Minister of Iraq today. And it's deeply questionable whether a coherent policy looking to turn back Iran can actually also, in the Iraqi context, be aligned with people who are themselves, in many ways, the servants of Islamic Republic of Iran. If we look at Lebanon, in the same way, it would seem to me, the continued commitment of the West to maintaining elements of the Lebanese state comes down today largely to defending and enabling a fiction to be maintained, a state that no longer exists, which means that it'll be receiving money, and that money and those resources will be used for quite different purposes. So the American context, a growing understanding of what needs perhaps to be focused on, but nevertheless it's some time till that starts to look into practical policy. And then additional countries, of course we should mention the Turks, very much in the news at the moment because of their military incursion into the Kurdish Afrin canton in northwest Syria in recent days. But in many ways, for reasons I can go into later if people want to, the weakest, or among the weakest of international players currently active in the Syrian stage, and of course the Saudis, the Qataris, and others playing secondary or tertiary roles today in the context of these three countries. So first, collapsed and fragmented spaces, war among the ruins, and a crucial role being played by regional and global players in defining the dynamic of what's been happening over the last 5, 6, 7 years. That's what then with regard to what's happening. How does my book and my project and my work fit into this? Well, Days of the Fall, the book which we're kind of here to discuss this evening, is an attempt to do a couple of things. First of all, it's an attempt to try to lay down the various phases that led to that currently existing situation I've just been trying to describe, the various phases the war went through. But it's not only an attempt to sort of outline that in dry prose, it's also an attempt to analyse and understand why what happened happened, and it's also an attempt to look down closely into what that meant in human terms for the people who were actually experiencing it. In other words, one can talk about the fact that Assad used barrel bombs against his own population as a means of war against civilians. But the book is an attempt not only to tell you that, but also to take you in as far as I can to what that actually felt like for people who are underneath those bomb attacks in areas entirely lacking, of course, any air capacity of their own, but also entirely lacking any anti-aircraft capability. And it was an utterly helpless civilian population. And the book intends to try and sort of perform a similar trick, if I can put it that way, for each phase of the war, so that we start off in Idlib province in 2012, really at the moment of birth of the Sunni Arab rebellion. A moment of, and I was there and I made my first trip into Syria at that time, February and March of 2012. A moment of great hope, and I think that's something which should be remembered for all the correct cynicism and scepticism that one must have today about the Syrian rebellion and what happened with it. Nevertheless, one should also remember that at that moment, when the first rebel-controlled enclaves began to emerge in northern Syria in 2012, this was a moment of quite genuine liberation for one of the most sorely oppressed populations, surely, on the planet at that time, who suddenly found, that the very brutal and murderous and repressive structure within which they'd been forced to grow up and live had vanished, had been driven back, and something else coming to replace it. And that was a moment of perhaps some possibility, and it was a moment that was lost. But it's a moment which, while lost, deserves, in my view at least, to be remembered, and that's where we start off, really. And we go through the book, and we go to the entry of the rebellion into Aleppo city, that seminal moment for the rebellion, and the furious attempts by the Assad regime to crush that and to push the rebellion back and out of Syria's most important city in a certain sense. And we then go on to look at the birth of Kurdish separatist arrangement in the northeast of the country. And I was also one of the first, not the first, but one of the first journalists to enter those areas too, the autonomous Kurdish areas, and to experience a very similar atmosphere actually to the birth of the rebellion in the northwest of the country, of very great and profound liberation. With all the problematic aspects that were and are of the governance there, profound liberation from the quite astonishing brutality that specifically the Kurds had been exposed to by the Arab nationalist Ba'athi regimes of the Assads and those who came before them. And then we look at the emergence of ISIS into that space, initially a mysterious organisation which then rapidly makes its agenda clear, and we cover the eruption of ISIS back into Iraq in the very dramatic events of the summer of 2014 when Baghdad and Erbil were genuinely menaced by the jihadis. And I was one of the people also who was there close to Mount Sinjar, 10 kilometres from Mount Sinjar, when the Yazidi people, if people remember this whole episode when the Yazidi people were faced with genocide at the hands of ISIS, and were only saved from that inevitable fate. Some of them unfortunately did suffer it, but were only saved, those who were saved, many thousands, because of the quite astonishing courage and selfless actions of Kurdish fighters at that time, who pushed a road through to the mountain and brought those people down. And I was there in the refugee camp with refugee families who'd just been brought down just 2 or 3 days, after those events themselves. So this is some of the stuff that's depicted in the book, and we go on to then effectively trace the trajectory of those 2 conflicts that have characterized events in Syria and Iraq for the last 3 or 4 years. The conflict between Assad and the rebellion against him, and the conflict between ISIS and the global coalition organised against it. And we then follow through the processes in which both those conflicts have kind of come to their denouement and their near conclusion. ISIS, of course, pushed back gradually in the city of losing its jewel in its crown in Iraq, the city of Mosul, pushed back down the Euphrates River Valley, and where we cover that together with some of the Iraqi and also the Syrian Kurdish fighters who achieved that quite impressive feat. And then further west, a rather sadder direction of events in which the rebellion, increasingly isolated, turns increasingly, of course, towards Sunni political Islam, often in some of its most ugly manifestations, and winds up at its twilight, so to speak, in southern Turkey, once the Russians have come in the summer, in the autumn rather, of 2015, facing the inevitability of probable defeat by that stage. And that's how much we also cover quite closely. And then we conclude, well, before we go to another aspect I should mention, which is in the book and hopefully will be interesting to people, and in any case is a force which we should mention again if we're talking about this stuff, is the Shia militias who were mobilized by a jihad fatwa of Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani, the most prominent Shia Ayatollah in Iraq, in the summer of 2014, but have stuck around. And we went with them deep into Anbar province in the summer of 2015, looking at their fight against the ISIS forces then retreating by that stage. And in the final part of the book, we cover, unfortunately, at least from my point of view, the side that appears to be the winning side in the battle between Assad regime and the rebellion against it, namely the regime itself. The book also tries to take the reader through some of the mechanics of how that stuff is done. In other words, how do you get into regime-controlled Syria? How do you find your way as a reporter when we know this is a murderous and brutal regime which wants very much to keep voices and reporters out of the areas it controls? So what are the ways that we found over the last 5-6 years to get round some of those restrictions, whether they were coming from the Assad regime or the Iraqi government or ISIS or the rebels or the Kurds or whenever there was an attempt to ensure silence, how did we manage nevertheless to get our eyes and our voices in there and then get out with the information? And the book also tries hard to discuss some of that too. So that's I think an important theme as well. So that basically is the book itself. It's both, as David was mentioning in terms of the work that I try and do, it's both an account and also an analysis, and it's also an attempt to take a stand against silence, if I can sound slightly pretentious for a moment. In other words, the fact is there have been a great deal many forces in Syria and Iraq trying to ensure silence and to try to stand against that. It would seem to me is a moral activity and something which is of importance. Just finally then, to talk a little bit about where things may be going in all this. Where are we headed now? We talked about 2 wars, the war between Assad regime and the rebellion against it, and the war between ISIS and the global coalition assembled against them. And both those wars do appear to be coming towards their conclusions. ISIS, at least as a quasi-state, is largely defunct now. The area it controlled, once a very large area, is now reduced to a few isolated, remote places. ISIS as a network, ISIS as a terror organization is not defunct, is not defeated. And it's worth remembering that ISIS was a terror organization before it was a quasi-state. Yeah? It comes from the Al-Qaeda branch in Iraq. So now what's happening is it's morphing back into what it was prior to the declaration of the Caliphate in early mid-2014, and back to an organisation that's carrying out some quite successful and quite large-scale terror attacks, even in recent weeks, in Baghdad, in Damascus, in Hasaka, and elsewhere. ISIS, however, as a quasi-state, is in the process of being defeated. So that war's coming to a certain conclusion. And the Assad war against the rebels is also coming to a certain conclusion. Frankly, the rebellion today, as originally conceived, no longer exists. What exists today in Syria is a number of remaining Sunni Arab fighters who are effectively acting as military contractors for a variety of different external states. In northwest Syria, they're acting as military contractors for the Turks, even as you're following your news feeds right at the moment. In southwest Syria, they're acting as military contractors for the Jordanians, and perhaps also to some degree for Israel too. And in southeast Syria, they're acting as military contractors on a smaller scale for the United States of America. So the rebellion as rebellion is largely a done deal. What's remaining are a few isolated enclaves, some of which may stand, some of which may fall. So that war is also coming to a conclusion. But, and on this I'll conclude these initial remarks, the fact that these two conflict systems are themselves coming towards some form of conclusion does not mean that what's about to descend on Iraq and Syria is peace, is a post-war period. What is happening, even as we follow our news feeds in recent days, what's clearly happening is that as these conflict systems wind down, new conflict systems are opening up to replace them. Because ISIS is no longer a major threat, and because the Americans have made clear they're going to continue to be in alliance even after ISIS with the Syrian Kurds, we now have in recent days the emergence of a brand new conflict between the Turkish armed forces, with the Syrian rebels acting as contractors for them, against the Syrian Kurds. So we have the birth of a new conflict there. In Iraq, the fact is that the crushing by the government of Kurdish secession doesn't mean that process is over forever. There's a great deal of very resentful Kurdish-speaking or Iraqi Kurds at the moment who wish to push that process forward again. That's going to lead to new conflict also. So the sense is then that there are new conflicts being born. And I want to say a final word, which is the following, and this I'll conclude. There are some observers and analysts of Syria and Iraq today who are taking the view that the conclusion of these two conflict systems will result in kind of the re-emergence of a strong Syria and a strong Iraq. There are those who characterize the return of the Assad regime in Syria and the Abadi government in Iraq's crushing of Kurdish secession as meaning that while we may have begun this talk, so to speak, talking about the fragmentation and collapse of states, actually now states are on their way back. I think we have to be very careful with that view, and the reason is the following. There's certainly something calling itself the Assad regime that is conquering more and more of Syria, and there's certainly something that calls itself the government in Iraq, which just dealt with a Kurdish attempt at secession. But if you look closely, these are not actually homegrown, strong, native governments. What they actually are is governments which are largely hollow and which are filled with the ambitions and the abilities of outside powers. Syria, the Assad regime may be coming back, but it's only coming back because the Russian Air Force is there and because very large numbers of pro-Iranian or Iranian-employed fighters are there on the ground to enable the Assad regime to come back. Assad is largely a figurehead in all that. The Abadi government may have dealt with Kurdish secessionism in Kirkuk in October of last year, but look a bit closer. Who were the fighters on the ground actually engaged in that? Look at the crucial role played by Iran-led Shia militias in the crushing of Kurdish secession, and the presence, even physical presence, of two very prominent Iraqi Shia militia commanders who work effectively for the Iranians, Hadi al-Amiri and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, with whom you can see an interview in the book because I interviewed him in Anbar in summer of 2015. They were there also in Kirkuk. So the notion of the return of the state, we need to problematize, if I can use that word, that idea very deeply. And then finally, just to conclude on the following note, this means conflict is going to continue, and one should bear in mind always the human cost of that. And just to remind us of the figures and of the extent of the Syrian war, which is the one that I've covered most closely in the last 6 years, around 500,000 dead. Just under 500,000 dead, around 6 million refugees, 5 million refugees, and an additional 6 million internally displaced persons out of a pre-war population of around 23 million. This is one of the greatest human disasters to have hit the Levant since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. this is something on an astonishing scale. Perhaps the central conflict system in our world today, taking in both the actions of states on the high level and terrible human suffering on the ground level. So it's something we're all going to be, here as Israelis and also as citizens and also as human beings, going to be looking very closely at, I think, for many years to come. I look forward to our discussion, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. And we're gonna, I believe the format, if I understand correctly, is that you guys don't get to talk yet. Okay, hang on. First, I'm gonna have a little conversation with him, which will allow you to listen in on. And then we're gonna ask Dr. Lerman to speak a bit on the Israeli perspective. And then, only then, we will then turn to questions and answers, which we very much look forward to. I was very stunned in reading this book, and I encourage all of you to not just read, but buy the book. I was very much struck by your presence on the ground and the details that you provide about how you had to, what you had to go through to get to the different places. I mean, this book covers perhaps the most complex conflict on earth since, I don't know, the Spanish Civil War, and or beyond. And you managed to you made a point of going into all of the different sides and factions. Can you talk a little bit about that, about what was required, what were the unique challenges, how this compares with previous combat zones that you've been to and that you've covered? How was this different, and what did it do to you?
Thanks for the question. Well, what it did to me, you should probably ask my friends, some of whom are here. Probably when I'm not in the room, because probably it's not all that complimentary, some of the responses. But what did it? How did it differ? What was the process we were able to use? Look, all of us who worked in that environment had to use a great deal of, I would say, initiative and original thinking, because these were quite unprecedented situations, actually. If we think, for example, about entering the rebel-controlled areas, as many of us did in 2012, when those rebel-controlled areas first emerged, this was, I think, pretty much the only time, at least which I can think of in the Middle East in recent memory, where an existing regime, not a regime that had lost power, but an existing regime had lost control over part of its own borders, while still maintaining, a military presence in the general area. That's logistically a very challenging thing. You want to get in. When we first went in February, March 2012, the Assad's army, the Syrian Arab army, was still deployed along that 900-kilometer border between Syria and Turkey. But what had happened was that the rebels further south had sort of carved out, not even enclaves at that stage, but kind of no-go areas for the regime, where the regime, no longer felt confident to come off the main roads. And as journalists, we were trying to get, under the fence, so to speak, and then south into those rebel-controlled areas, past Assad's army. So this wasn't a simple thing to do logistically, and you had to, you had to work very hard with that, and you had to be tremendously careful as well, of course, because many of the forces who were allegedly trying to help you get in, had their own agendas. I think I was helped by the fact that I started writing about Syria some years before the war, and so I had quite good contacts among the Syrian opposition, which meant that I was able to only deal with people I knew. And that was very important. If we look at some of our colleagues who suffered disaster in the course of attempting to cover the Syrian war, look, it's a war, it's risky in any case, but one of the ways they took too much risk was they trusted people they shouldn't have trusted. They were keen to get across the border, and they just listened to anybody who they met in a coffee house in Antakya who could take them across the border. That was a big mistake, and some people paid the price for that. I was lucky enough to not have to do that, because I had a very decent and existing network in place when the war began. With regard to the regime side, and with regard to interviewing ISIS, which I did a little bit of, I never entered the ISIS-controlled areas, then of course again you have to be creative and you have to be sensible about how much you're going to reveal to the people involved and so on and so forth. A great deal of improvisation and quick thinking, I think, is required for anybody who wants to do this kind of stuff. I'd strongly recommend it, by the way, because it's also good fun to do quite often. And that's pretty much the strength of it. What does it do to you? Well, I mean, how does it differ from other combat zones? Well, the other combat zone that I knew best, I've covered some other places since and before, but the one that I knew best was, of course, Israel and our own low-intensity conflicts against Palestinian organisations in recent years, in which I took part as a reserve soldier, and also the Lebanon War of 2006. How does it differ? Look, this will sound obvious, but it differs in its magnitude. It differs in the magnitude of the butcher's bill, of the number of people that give their lives. Here in Israel, we are able, given the dimensions of the current security challenges to Israel, to give great attention and to feel a great sense of tragedy whenever a soldier is killed, and that's and that's something which we're able to do because things are on a relatively small scale. The killing in Syria is on an industrial scale. For 500,000 people to be killed in the course of 5 or 6 years of war requires a volume of loss of life, which is utterly different to anything certainly which I'd ever experienced prior to that. And when you go to military funerals in which 5 or 6 young people are being buried at once, and the people will tell you, because we have these funerals about every week. We haven't got the time or the ability to give everybody their own funeral. Then you get the sense of the magnitude of the human cost of this, and that's something which I certainly hadn't experienced before, and which I certainly have felt, affected by and thought about a lot.
And I want to go into, I know that you answered all the parts of the question except for the one that was most personal, so I'm gonna not let you off the hook and actually expand the question.
I thought we were friends.
We were.
Yeah, that's right, we were.
What is it about you, about your past, about your career, about the secret comings and goings of your parents? No, just kidding. No, seriously, what has built up in your life to lead you to undertake what most people I know would consider a preposterous course of action, to throw yourself into this kind of a conflict zone? I mean, I understand I also feel a moral duty to speak out, but I didn't get on a plane. So if you could maybe just talk a little bit about what led up over the course of your life and career to writing this book, and not just this book, you also wrote a number of other essays over the course of this conflict. What is it? Tell us a bit about your story that helps us understand who is the person writing this book.
This is not something which I'm am used to going into great detail about. I do think that everybody who has an experience of everyone who does conflict journalism or whatever one would call it comes to that path in a different way. I'm not somebody, I think, who's throughout my life been sort of fascinated by conflict or war or something. Not particularly. I was fascinated, I think, by policy and by the actions of states and the process of that, rather more than kinetic conflict and frontline action. To tell you the truth, I mean, I had my first real experience of war as a soldier in the Lebanon War of 2006, and I suspect that had I not had that experience, I might well not have really got involved in covering conflict, because actually armed conflict and the experience of it was not really particularly part of my own experience up until that point, apart from a few little skirmishes during the Second Intifada and so on, but nothing on that level of magnitude. So I think, in a certain sense, armed conflict kind of imposed itself on me rather than the other way around, or a mind consciousness rather than the other way around, in the course of the War of 2006. And as a result of that, I don't want to use the word fascination, that doesn't sound right at all, but you know, at that as an area of human activity with its own, well, with its own very fascinating elements, with its own morally challenging elements and so on, became something that I thought about a lot in the period following the 2006 war. And everybody here, I think, remembers that period in the country at the time as well, which was a time of very great questioning, I think, for many of us, you know, including many of us who maybe had put our faith, perhaps naively so, in the rightness of our leaders' decision making and the ethical standing of some of our leaders, and came back from the war with a great many questions about that, and also about the experience of armed conflict itself. And having had that initial experience when the wars in Syria began, because I'd been writing about Syria for some years also prior to the wars, it seemed obvious to me that, well, you know, I'm somebody who has had the experience of frontline conflict. I'm not frightened of the notion of that. It's not a foreign country for me, and this is a fascinating political process that I've been writing about in any case for years. Plus the thing which you mentioned at the beginning, David, which is also the moral element of bearing witness, which, without wishing to sort of, you know, cover myself in garlands of moral glory, you know, is not entirely not part of it, you know. So put those three things together, and then you get a very natural process of decision making. And the thing is, once you enter into it, probably like many other things, once you enter into it, it's a little bit hard to kick the habit, because there is so much more always to do. There are so many new stories emerging. The Syrian war went through so many, you know, fascinating phases, whereby the fact that you were there in Aleppo when the regime army pushed into Aleppo to try and to drive the rebellion out didn't mean that you understood the ISIS war. It didn't mean that you understood what happened in Kobani, you know, in 2014. It didn't mean any of that. You had to go back constantly to bear witness, to build up knowledge, to tell the story. It needed to be done again and again and again. So once one starts doing it, you tend to stick at it. You get better at it as well, is the other thing. Like anything else, reporting on conflict has its own trajectory and learning curve, and as you get better at it, you realise you're faced with new challenges, and you hopefully deal with those well and move on ahead as well. So I think that's the process, really, if I can, that was it.
Thank you. I'm sure that many of the people here are interested in hearing a little bit on the Israel side, and we're going to hear a lot about it from Dr. Lerner, but I do want to ask you, sorry, Dr. Lerman, but I do want to ask you, I remember, and I'm sure, judging from the ages, the great majority of the people here remember the first Iraq War and the Scud missiles. Okay, there was a sense of almost inevitability that in any conflict, someone's going to try to drag Israel into it. And yet we see here a conflict that had so many forces, and every single one of them could have tried to play an Israel card and tried to pull Israel into the conflict, and yet somehow, just a few miles away from the Golan, over on this side of the border, Israel managed to stay out of this. Can you say a little bit about, from your perspective, what do you think was different that Israel did, or that was different about the conflict that made it possible for Israel to stay completely out?
Yeah, so I think there's a number of factors here. First of all, it's important to remember that the people who would have been most likely to have wanted to draw Israel in, which would have been, of course, the regime, Hezbollah, Iran side, were, you know, really fighting for their lives, or at least fighting for the lives of one of them, Assad and his regime, for the greater part of the last 5 or 6 years. Pulling Israel in just wasn't a luxury they could afford. The fact is they were having a hard time fighting against a poorly armed, ragtag group of Sunni Arab rebels for the last 5 or 6 years, and in fact, in my estimation at least, had the Russian air power not appeared over the skies of Syria on September 30th, 2015 and onwards, they would probably have lost their war to the Sunni Arab rebels. They were doing very, very badly in the summer of 2015. So they just didn't have the luxury of trying to pull in, you know, a vastly more powerful enemy when they were having a very difficult time even dealing with the enemies that they had. With regard to, and by the way, let me just say, in addition to that, having spent some time now in regime-controlled Syria, you know, we shouldn't think in any way that they've forgotten us. the same old, good old Baathi atmosphere of Israeli conspiracies and Zionist conspiracies is, you'll be happy to hear, or maybe not, is alive and well in the mass on the level of discourse. So the fact that they haven't drawn Israel in militarily doesn't mean they've forgotten about Israel at all. With regard to the rebels, it's quite a different story. Look, the rebellion did emerge from that kind of Arab Spring moment that we all remember, and something about the Arab Spring that we remember is not that anybody in Egypt or Tunisia or anywhere else became pro-Israel. They didn't. But what they did become were people who were mainly concerned, at least for the immediate moment, with their own issues, which they were very busy with. And they didn't have that much time to be thinking about other stuff. I've come across some pretty florid conspiracy theories on the rebel side too, with regard to Israel. You certainly come across them. But at the same time, the rebellion, for the most part, was busy also with its own project. The other thing is to remember is that the only people who you could actually point a finger at and say, well, they have made some efforts to draw Israel in would be the rebels, namely the rebels in Quneitra and that area, where they have on occasion sought, for example, to ensure that Israel would respond militarily to actions taken by the Assad regime elsewhere, and they don't necessarily have a problem with, they don't mind necessarily if stray ordnance lands in Israel, because they know that Israel will always punish the regime for it rather than the rebellion. So there's some sort of small examples of this, but nothing on a major level. And the Kurds, obviously, who themselves, in both iterations, by the way, not only the Iraqi Kurds, but also the Syrian Kurds, are on quite a base level quite sympathetic to Israel, nevertheless are a long, long way away from Israel and don't really have a practical reason to draw Israel in. So I think those are the main reasons. All the sides have been extremely busy, which means, of course, that as the war against the Assad regime and Iran and Hezbollah's war against the Sunni Arab rebellion winds down, and it is winding down, as we discussed earlier, that means quite possibly that Israel begins to come back onto the agenda. And in this regard, all of us, I think, who watch Syria closely are looking at southwest Syria right now with some concern, and I'm sure Iran will speak in greater detail about this in a moment, with the knowledge that there are Iranian proxy ambitions with regard to the border with Israel. There is the land corridor. It was the regime side that captured Abu Kamal, that border crossing on Syria-Iraq border. So they have that contiguous line all the way through. They certainly have an interest in pushing it as far west as they can towards the Quneitra crossing on the Golan Heights. Israel has been very clear on a number of occasions that's not something which Israel will permit. So many of us are now looking at the situation with the possibility that the long period in which we were not part of the picture may, in one way or another, begin to be drawn to a close.
One last question. Could you please tell us the story about how you got the guy fired and who it was and what happened to you before, during, and after that?
The Syrian information minister was a man called Mohammed Turjuman, and the method that we were able to use to get me into regime control Syria, it wasn't my idea, by the way. I think the person whose idea it was is in the room and knows who he is, but I won't identify him. The method we used was by joining on to a delegation of pro-regime journalists and activists from both the Arab world and beyond it. The delegation was sponsored by the Syrian Ministry of Information, and the ministry, we met with the minister on a number of occasions in the course of being in Syria, and we had a ministry minder with us throughout, and the ministry was responsible for the project. Of course, when I came back from Syria and began to write articles in the Western media about the trip, it rapidly became obvious who I had been. There was a certain degree of anger on the part of the organisers of the delegation and indeed its other participants. Then nothing much happened, but when we got to the end of last year, there was a cabinet reshuffle, I think the expression is, in the Assad's cabinet, and two ministers lost their jobs. One was the defence minister, and that was absolutely nothing to do with me, I can assure you. And the other was Turjuman. Now, was it really the reason, was I the reason that that happened? According to Al Arabiya, the Saudi news site, yes it was. They had a very long, gloating and teasing article in which they said, ho, 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 you see, you couldn't keep this Israeli out, and now Turjuman has lost his job. There you are. Was it true or not? I don't know. I presume that the Syrian regime doesn't give interviews to Al Arabiya, so this is to some degree a matter of amused speculation on the part of Al Arabiya. Nevertheless, it was what it was, and the Israeli media took a great deal of interest in it, and so it was interesting to talk about. Turjuman didn't come across to me as an especially unpleasant man on a personal level. Having said that, there are a great deal of people suffering in Syria, a great deal more than Muhammad Turjuman, even if he no longer has his ministerial Mercedes. So I'm not given to an excessive amount of sadness with regard to what happened.
Thank you so much. I would like to now invite Dr. Van Leerman to say a few words.
Well, reading Jonathan's book brought back the years that I spent from my vantage point at the National Security Staff, monitoring the Syrian situation as it evolved and trying to figure out what is our angle, what it should be, what can we do, and even more significantly, what is it that we cannot do and need not try to do. And it was tough. It was not nearly as tough as anything that Jonathan went through, going in and out. He had the benefit, if that's the proper term, of experience on the ground. But we were reading quite a lot, including his reporting. And I have to say, I have to mention here that I'm grateful for the immense help I got at that long vigil from a civil servant who happens to be Druze, who is now actually the head of Middle Eastern Affairs at the National Security Staff, and was our ear and watchful eye on Syria throughout that period. And it so happened that this way we ended up having a better sense of what was going on, a better piece of analysis to put on the table of decision makers than the organization in which I grew up, the Directorate of Military Intelligence and other intelligence agencies, which got it wrong. Remember that one of the brightest men ever to have served in high position in Israel came with the prediction that Assad will be gone in 5 weeks. It's been a long 5 weeks. And the challenge here was a dual challenge. There was an intellectual challenge, trying to understand what is really going on, and against the background of at first, the enthusiasm and the drama of the so-called, now pathetically so-called, Arab Spring elsewhere in the region, and why Syria was going to be different. But there was also a moral challenge, and the moral challenge is still with us. It is one thing to analyze the Syrian landscape and come to the conclusion, the bitter, disillusioned conclusion, that the Assad regime is there to stay, at least in very significant parts of what the French used to call la Syrie utile, the useful Syria, the populated parts of Western Syria. At some point we started calling it Western Minoritistan, because it was not just the Alawis, there were others, the Christians, Druze, others who were, and quite a number of fat Sunni cats who grew comfortable with the regime over the years as Rami Makhlouf was eating the country with a big spoon, and there were dollops thrown around for others. And the country, at the end of the day, there were enough people out there who had a stake in Assad's survival for various reasons. And it is another thing to see this, you know, and to realize that this is a despicable, murderous regime. But we are not going to be in a position to bring about, even if this is what any moral person under the sky should have wished for, this is not what's going to happen. so I ended up, I think Jonathan will remember, in my office I had a little green book. It was Julius Caesar, the Gallic Wars. And speaking of Syria, I used to start by quoting the first line, which is about as far as my Latin goes, let me not delude you. Omnes Gallia intres partes divisa est. All of Gaul is divided in 3 parts, and I said, and so is Syria. And this, and what Jonathan experienced firsthand, and what we actually end up seeing right now is a partition of sorts, by now a very unequal partition. And we had to think long and hard about how we should regard each and every of these parts, the regime part, which is now predominant, the Sunni areas, and I have a thing or two to say about that, and the Kurds. Given that these are not our traditional friends, the Barzanis up north in Iraq, these are the PKK, more or less transformed into something else, radical Marxists of some sort, but still, I cannot hide from you that morally, when they stood, men and women, up to ISIS and Kobani, our hearts went out to them. Now, Israel was not entirely out of the game. There are 3 things that should be mentioned, delicately enough. One is that the Kurds, particularly in the horrifying moments of the summer of 14, did get first of all, our political support, speaking to others in the international community about their plight. And beyond that, I'm not sure it is, I don't want to go into detail, but there was an effort, an international effort of sorts to help them, and Israel was not entirely a bystander in that effort, in the summer of 14. The second thing that you are probably all aware of is what we're doing vis-a-vis the immediate neighborhood on our border. Bringing the wounded in and providing some sort of elementary help to areas directly on our border, on our Golan border. And again, I have to say, we needed to be very, very sober about what we could and could not do. When people came to me to say we need to deal with something like the southern Syria area that was reminiscent of the southern Lebanon area, I said, forget about it. This southern Syria alone is far too big for us to handle. Let's talk about the Syria border area, where we could here and there make a difference. But let's remember that getting ourselves as a player into the larger Syria arena is far beyond our capacity, and we do not have the means and the intimate knowledge to do so. But we do have a neighbor with an interest as vital as our own in the outcome in Syria, namely the Kingdom of Jordan. And we should be there for them in the sense that they can undertake certain levels of risk, managing what they can in the Syrian situation, with the knowledge that if things go catastrophically wrong, and this is not me saying it, it is the way the Jordanians see it, continue to see it throughout the tiff we had in the last few months, we have their back. And so Jordan did play and continued to play and continues to play a major role in certain aspects of the Syrian situation. And it can do so, it can take the risks involved in doing so, because for 2 generations now, since 1970, Jordan has been inside our strategic orbit. And as you know, the main thrust of the coalition military effort against ISIS was conducted from Jordan. Because they, as we all know, the Turks, to say that they were ambivalent is, and Jonathan knows this better than the most, to say that they're ambivalent is an understatement. And so, yeah, we were not entirely, we were certainly not disinterested, and we were not entirely outside the game, but it was clear that any direct Israeli imprint beyond our immediate border area would probably do more harm than good to those we would go to help. And I was surprised that some of Israel's brightest minds, like Amos Yadlin at the INSS, at one point suggested we should go in and destroy the Assad regime. There is such a thing known as the China shop rule. And had we broken Syria, we would have owned it. We cannot afford it. So, what could we do? We did try to speak to our American friends about managing the Sunni space. That was before ISIS drove all before them and took over. And there was actually a foundation that could have been utilized, which was the American experience in Western Iraq during the surge, in the really last stages of the Bush administration, and when David Petraeus managed this operation in a way that brought the Sunnis of Iraq in as an ally, based to a large extent on a tribal template. This should have been done in Syria. It was not done in Syria. It was not done in Syria because the Americans were, already out of Iraq, and by the way, left the Iraqi Sunnis to their own fate, which made them easy prey for ISIS when they came in. And it was not done systemically in Syria as it could have been, so that a Sunni space, a moderate Sunni space, could emerge instead of being taken over by the Salafi jihadis and the various elements thereof. But since it was not done, it was increasingly clear that the Islamists are the only, that with all due respect to the FSA, the Free Syrian Army, and the idealists in exile that were telling us beautiful stories and the hopeful young people, men and women that Jonathan met on his missions, the rebel operation was falling increasingly into the hands of the wrong people. And that made our choices in Syria even more problematic. Ultimately, I tend to agree with Jonathan that in the summer of 15, the Russians went in not because they wanted to demonstrate Russian muscle and impress the world with their prowess. They went there because they felt that otherwise Assad was finished. His military was by then good for nothing, and we saw this in Palmyra, in Tadmor. I heard it directly from him. Now, what happened since is the key to our present policy, and this is where I want to focus for a minute before I reopen this. Something fascinating happened. If you recall, Prime Minister Netanyahu went to Moscow immediately after the Russian intervention. And I hope I offend no one if I suggest that Putin could have easily suggested that he should F off. And that now that they have taken the risk of going into Syria, they own Syria, and we have no business doing anything there. That's not what the Russians said. They said, give me some of your good Russian speakers and we'll talk deconfliction. This is not, secret information. It was all over the media at the time, and this still is the case. Now, what does that mean? It means he's basically signaling to Assad. He says, look, to his chinless wander in Damascus. He says, look, we've saved you from the gallows. We are here to demonstrate to the world that our client lives, whereas look at the Americans guy in Cairo and ending up in the cage on the stage. But if you think we are going to be there, if you tangle with the Israelis on Iran's behalf, you misread the situation. I think at the bottom of this is a healthy Russian respect for Israeli military capabilities, a respect that we are maintaining by doing things that signal that we are very serious about what we told. And I'm not going to go into detail because it's the government policy for a good reason not to go into detail. And so what we are doing now, amidst the ruins, is to look for daylight, as they call it, for a crack of difference, a serious crack of difference, between the Russian position and, or to be precise, the Russian purpose in Syria and the Iranian purposes. The Russians want to save Assad, to show the world that they could, and they did, and to sustain their gains, which are the airbase in Khmeimim and the new franchise in Tartus. But they have no wish to see Syria being dragged into a conflict with Israel, given what they know about Israeli abilities. The Iranians, on the other hand, have to use Syria for the realization of Ali Khamenei's design. I don't know how many of you recall his tweet from November 14, shortly after the end of the fighting in Gaza, in which he gave, I think, 9 reasons and ways for destroying Israel. And one of the main points, and I've seen this now in some memory reporting being revived, is this business of arming the West Bank, turning the West Bank into the next Gaza. You know, I wouldn't recommend to people in Nablus to go dancing in the streets at the proposition. But this is what, if this is what the Iranians want to do, you look at the map and you realize they have to destabilize Jordan. And the only way to destabilize Jordan, you cannot destabilize Jordan from the border crossings with Iraq, which are easily managed. You have to destabilize Jordan from southern Syria. And then have the use of Jordan the way the Palestinians had it before 1970, or the way Hamas enjoyed the use of Sinai before Sisi started making it very difficult for them to do so. So the destabilization of Jordan becomes the key, and it is in our interest for the Russians to be in a position to whisper in Assad's ear, don't make that mistake. This is the game we are in now. It's not an easy one, because the Iranians and the Russians do stand shoulder to shoulder in fighting for Assad. But it is not a hopeless proposition that we can drive this wedge effectively. And you probably noticed that there is an American, Russian, Jordanian memorandum of understanding as to what should happen in southern Syria. I think it will be fair to speculate that we were not uninvolved. And one last point. It is not morally justifiable to draw any sense of satisfaction from what happened in Syria over the last 7 years. It's a catastrophically sad story. But we do need to bear in mind that what we've seen, among other things, is the removal for a very long time ahead from the strategic equation against Israel of the largest standing Arab army, if you don't count the Egyptians, who are now these parties. And also the moral state that now attaches to our worst active enemy, namely Hezbollah, in the eyes of much of the Arab world. It's one thing to be in the business of killing Jews, and it's another altogether, if you forgive the alliteration, to be seen slaughtering Sunnis in the streets of Syria. And that, I think, has left its mark on the present dynamics between us and much of the Sunni world are looking for. So that's also an aspect of the Syrians. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to open it up to questions, but first I would just like to point out to the folks who are standing, there are a few open seats here if you want to come up and join. First question, let's always, Winky has actually been waving, and waving apparently overcomes most just hand raising. Go ahead.
Obama's red line. A, did he make a decision not to hold them to the red lines because of his political philosophy, personal philosophy, or because he was told so by, according to your estimation, internal military or foreign State Department estimations? And if he had held them to those red lines at that time, was there an actual chance to do something, or was he just blowing off an idea about red lines with the gas attacks? In other words, could he have been effective if he had made a decision to go ahead and hold them to the red lines?
Is this Jonathan?
Yeah, direct the question to the
Whoever wants
I have
to,
something to say about it before.
Jonathan first.
Well, look, with regard to why he chose to not act, why he chose to allow the red line not to be enforced, I think there's a number of factors. I think, first of all, the Obama presidency was characterized by a strategic decision to walk back the American footprint in the region. He inherited two expensive and not especially popular wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. He wanted to be the person who would be able to say, I took America out of those wars. And the last thing he wanted on his watch was to have to say, oh, and I also got us involved in another thing which we weren't involved in before. So there was an absolute strategic decision on the part of that presidency to walk back that involvement. I also tend to be convinced by those arguments that relate this also to the Iran nuclear negotiations at the time, and the sense that Obama was determined not to in any way complicate the picture of harmonious relations that he was trying to build up with the Iranians, moving towards the signing of JCPOA, and given the, of course, very central importance that the Iranians attached to the survival of Assad regime. The last thing he wanted to be doing was to be engaging in war effectively against an Iranian client, whilst at the same time negotiating about the nuclear file. It's kind of ironic, of course, isn't it, that the JCPOA, as it eventually emerged, was an agreement that specifically says we're not mentioning anything else other than the nuclear program. Iran's regional activities is not part of it. But I do think that the other way around, it was a very important part of that decision. And just lastly, what could he have done? 2 points actually about this. First of all, had the decision to enforce the red line turned into a more general decision to support the Syrian rebellion against Assad at that stage, we're in the summer of 2013 by now, in my estimation at least, and I've written this at the time as well, it was already too late. In other words, the thing that Iran mentioned a moment ago, the way in which the rebellion gradually got taken over by Sunni Islamists, by the summer of 2013 it would already have been too late. Had you tried to help them, you would have been pouring money into what was and would have remained a Sunni Islamist rebellion. But having said that, if what America wanted to do was to enforce the general provision or general international norm forbidding the use of chemical weapons by the use of American air action against the regime, of course there was a very big target bank they could have chosen to have acted against, but they chose not to.
Well, there are plenty of reasons for us to be unhappy with some of Obama's decisions. Frankly, from where I sat at the time, I can carefully say this was not one of them. Leaving aside the question of whether Israel would have been dragged in or would have paid the price, when the Russians made the offer to the Americans to, instead of a military strike, which was really on the verge of being carried out, they would bring Assad to the point of giving up, as it turned out, most, the great majority, almost all, of his chemical arsenal. This was for us, in all likelihood, a much better outcome than a half-hearted American military strike would have produced. In fact, for Israel, the removal of the Syrian chemical arsenal from our strategic calculus was a net benefit of the First Order. So, the consequence of an American strike could have been quite problematic, and given that the Obama administration did no longer have the option of building up a viable and friendly alternative to the Assad regime, I think the idea that the decision was taken at the time to take the Russian option was not necessarily a bad idea from our point of view.
But I also want to add just a little point on this. Jeffrey Goldberg, in his essay in The Atlantic, Jeffrey Goldberg was one of the most, the journalists that had the greatest access to President Obama at the time. He described the Red Line episode in which the president chose not to attack Syria as, in the president's own eyes, a moment of personal liberation. Okay, it was within sort of the Obama worldview. He had spent his entire political career fighting against what the folks called the blob, which was the combination of forces in Washington, the establishment, the Arab lobby, the Israel lobby, that were all conspiring to drag America into conflict against what Obama wanted. And this was, in his view, a decisive moment, not of weakness, but of personal courage and strength, to say no to all of that and to move forward ahead. And he did end up getting that Iran deal that Ben Rhodes referred to as the Obamacare of the second term, meaning the most significant policy achievement in their own eyes that they could achieve. So I don't think you can talk about the Red Line decision without bringing in some of Obama's own personal kind of view of it. I personally, well, whatever. Yes, in the back.
Given the massive demographic catastrophe because of the Syrian civil war, in terms of the 500,000 people who've been killed and the millions of internally and externally displaced refugees, and is there a systematic effort by the Assad regime to shift the demographics of the country to shore up his control and authority? And if this is the case, how much of it is being supported or even directed from Iran? And my question is for the entire panel.
Very quickly, I think the regime actually has no interest in ending the war. Because the moment the war ends, Sunnis in Turkey and Jordan and Lebanon will be clamoring to get back. And he quite enjoys the idea of a Syria with 6 million Sunnis less. I'm not sure he has a real interest in bringing this to a real close. To kind of stabilization, yes. But I have a growing sense that the regime has a vested interest in the existing situation.
So I would say that we can pick up some indications that, specifically in the territorial area between Damascus and the Lebanese border, that there is an interest in Sunnis not returning to there, and that there's an interest on the part of the Iranians in settlement of Shia and Alawi population there, having a sort of territorial contiguity of non-Sunni Arab population between Damascus and the Lebanese border, and there are indications there that that's being undertaken. Having said that, I very much agree with what Ilan was saying, but I note a certain contradiction in Assad's behaviour, in the sense that he does seem to be extremely serious about the notion of reconquering the entire country. And I'm not sure if Assad has entirely thought this through, because if you reconquer Idlib province, you know, you're not going to be in a position to simply drive out the hundreds of thousands of Sunni Arabs there. And the fact of the matter is that he clearly does want to reconquer it. He's clearly trying very hard and wasting no time in doing the best he can to wipe out the remaining Sunni Arab rebel-held areas. But he's going to inherit those Sunnis, and somewhere down the line, it would seem to me, he may well find that trouble's waiting down the road. I have the slight sense that his Russian advisors are a little bit more cool-headed with regard to this, and are not necessarily encouraging him to go rushing into these adventures. But my sense with the regime, and I had this also from speaking closely with the regime people we met in April in Damascus and elsewhere, was they do regard the notion of that Syria belongs to them. It's their private farm, so to speak, and that they have every right to urgently retake it. You know, that's a real incentive and imperative for them, it would seem, with all the demographic troubles that may well, you know, accompany the achievement of that objective.
Yeah. These are great questions.
On a scale of 1 to 10, how likely is a possibility or a likelihood that the Iranian regime will change if America, Israel, the Kurds, and the Jordanians unite against the Iranian regime?
Yeah, just briefly then to begin. I mean, well, a scale of 1 to 10, I don't know. Arithmetic was always my worst subject. But in terms of the likelihood of the overthrow of the Iranian regime, look, we witnessed just now of course, the very determined demonstrations in tens of Iranian cities. But we also witnessed the speed and skill with which the regime managed to crush those economically based demonstrations based on economic discontent. Revolutions are a tricky thing, and sort of directing revolutions from outside, you know, in enemy countries is an extremely tricky thing. There are a few powers in history that ever managed to bring off such a thing. We think of one or two examples. It's generally a thing that's beyond the pay grade, beyond the power of governments to do. My own sense is the following, and this is at least my 2 cents worth, so to speak, with regard to the recent events, which I think brings us back to the broader Iranian position, is the following. For a revolution to succeed, you need a revolutionary party. I don't mean a political party, but you need an organised group of people with a clear political programme, with a level of public support, and with a clear and coherent strategy for bringing down the regime in question. Yeah? In Iran today, all the evidence suggests that no such party exists. And for as long as it does not exist, it would seem to me, the regime, which after all is a revolutionary regime itself, right? This is a bunch of people who as young men carried out their own successful revolution in 1979. That regime will probably succeed in directing the very broad and entirely justified public anger that appears to exist. This is a regime which throughout the course of the Syrian war, which after all we've been focusing on here, this is a regime which found the ability, even at a time when it was under real and biting sanctions, to find tens of billions of dollars to give to a regional ally as part of a regional project. That's a regime that is confident in its own position, and I suspect they have good reason to
I'm not
be
talking about
confident for years ahead.
a revolution, I'm talking about an implosion, just as the Soviet regime imploded because they couldn't compete with America on the weapons issue.
Okay, I understand that. Look, it's an interesting comparison. Iran does have very broad economic problems. I do think that if, you know, I hope very much there will be increased pressure on the Iranian regime, and it is one possibility, as happened with the Soviet Union, that if you force the Iranian regime to overspend, so to speak, on external defense and attention, that can exacerbate and bring about internal discontent. Yes, I think so. I think maybe what we witnessed in recent weeks was actually part of that equation. They overreached themselves with external commitments, they paid the price internally. Yes, I think it's a possibility. It's not inevitable, and we're right now, at least, I think, a very long way away from it. I would draw also one additional difference here between the gerontocracy, so to speak, of the Soviets in the 70s and 80s, and these guys here in Iran. That Soviet Union by the 70s and 80s was a very, very old revolution. The guys running it were 3 generations into it. They were old, they were lost, nobody believed in it anymore. My many friends from the former Soviet Union tell me that by that stage nobody in those countries really took seriously the idea behind the revolution anymore. Iran's not like that. Many people in Iran oppose the regime, of course, but the regime does have a hard core of very real and very active support, which would need to be got beyond for this scenario to play out. I wouldn't say it's impossible, but I certainly wouldn't see it as being the most likely thing to happen, let's say, in the next decade or so.
Well, just to be slightly more optimistic, I think the fact that the regime responded just this week by basically beginning to take away the IRGC economic privileges is an indication that they were actually quite scared about what happened. And that their sense of just how safe the ground is under their feet may be quite tenuous. And this is even before any sanctions are reimposed or greater pressures are being applied. There's some, I'm not sure there are any general rules about international events, but there's a pattern that revolutions very often originate in countries which have been under huge external pressure or after huge external expenditures and wars and adventures. You know, the American Revolution breaks after Britain gets itself spent to death, half to death in the 7 Years' War, the French the same, Russia of course in 1917, and so pressures. If there is, let me put it in reverse, if there is ever to be a chance of destabilizing the regime from within, it needs to be sustained, there needs to be a sustained external pressure on the regime from outside.
And that pressure, if it's economic, will necessarily come from the United States much more than the other places in the nation. We have time for two final questions. You in the back, and then you in the front. Yeah.
I have a question that I'm confident will be extremely popular in this crowd. I'm curious what the role of the United Nations should have been. Whether there is or whether
This
there's
is not funny.
yeah. Guys, I'm very serious. No, I really should it have. It hasn't been mentioned yet tonight, which says volumes about the United Nations. But does it have? Should it have had a role? Does it have a role? Sort of, how do you see that entity in the greatest crisis, happening in the world, or a humanitarian crisis, certainly in the world right now?
Okay, so look, we need to remember that in the United Nations Security Council, which is where serious UN action originates from, there are countries which have permanent members which have veto power. Among those countries are Russia and China, which means that the possibility of coherent and determined international action via the UN against the Assad regime was vanishingly close to zero, because anything serious would have been vetoed quite clearly and on the table by the Russians and the Chinese, right from the beginning and all throughout. As a result of that, we've seen what you were hinting at. We've seen a great deal of activity with no particular chance of results. Stefan de Mistura, if the name means anything to you, and the long, drawn-out Geneva diplomatic, but not by chance it means nothing to you. We're now on to, I think, Geneva 7, and the 7th stage of the Geneva talks that are supposedly those administered by Mr. de Mistura that are supposed to bring the Syrian war to a close. They hardly receive even any media coverage anymore. The Russians are now long into their own parallel process taking place in Astana and now in Sochi, which also, by the way, isn't going to lead to the end of the war, but that's another story. So the UN was not able from the very start, because of the very nature of it and its members of the UNSC, to do anything substantive. What they have done is a great deal of procedural and non-substantive activity, which has not led very far.
Can I ask maybe a follow-up to that point then? Have countries that have generally been appreciative of the United Nations become frustrated by that?
Well, certainly there's been some very loud grumbling from Europeans about the Russians and the Chinese foiling any attempt to move against us at the early stages. That was very yes, it raised larger questions about the UN as an institution. I will say for Stefan de Mistura that here and there some lives were saved by local arrangements that the UN was able to organize exchanges of population in embattled areas, evacuation, here and there corridors of humanitarian supply, minor, very minor actions against the background of a general catastrophe, but they were not entirely without an impact on the ground.
Great. Our last question for the evening. So,
Okay. The conflict in Syria and before that in Iraq has given rise to a nascent Kurdish national identity, nation perhaps. How can Israel play that card to its advantage? Is it to Israel's advantage?
Well,
question.
can we and should we play the Kurdish card to our advantage? Well, I think there's also a question of whether what choices we make will be to the Kurds' advantage. I think there's no, it's not a secret that we've always harbored a profound sympathy for Kurdish ambitions. In the past, this is documented, of course, until the Iranians and Henry Kissinger betrayed the Barzani uprising in 1975, Israel was involved in supporting the Kurds in their struggle in northern Iraq. More recently, I think there have been expressions of support for Kurdish independence by key people in the Israeli government. But at the end of the day, given the limitations on our impact, we should be careful not to provide the Kurds enemies with the capacity to argue that this is another part of some vast Zionist conspiracy. Behind the scenes, I think it is and should be our work to try and mitigate the impact of the abandonment of the Kurds in the last round by the United States, and basically to shift the policy from no to not now or not yet, which is the best the Kurds can hope for right now.
Yeah, so just very briefly, I very much agree with what Elan said. My own view is the following. It is in Israel's interest for the currently existing Kurdish entities in northern Iraq and in northeastern Syria to survive.
And Iran.
Excuse me?
And also in Iran.
Iran is another question because these are the Kurds of silence, if I can put that expression, vastly under a level of repression, which means that for them to even independently organize is very hard. But in northern Iraq and in Syria, there are existing autonomous entities close to sovereignty in some ways. It's definitely in Israel's interest for those to survive. It almost mathematically means that the forces opposed to us in those countries are weaker as a result of the surviving and flourishing of those entities. And I very much agree also with what Elan was hinting at, which is that the way in which we can play a role in that is not necessarily through direct and open relationships with those entities, but it is through the fact that insofar as we may have influence and our voice is listened to among those Western countries that do have the ability, do have the Kurds' fate in their hands to some degree, that we can make our voice heard, in support of the survival and continued flourishing of those two entities.
Thank you all very much. Paul, do you want to say final words?
I'll just say firstly, thank you very much to our panel. I think you will agree with me. As I said at the beginning, this is the first of what I hope will be many such public events here at the Centre for English speakers. We're really looking to get a conversation going among English speakers here in Jerusalem around the issues here in Israel, the wider Middle East, the wider Jewish world, and I think this was an amazing event to kick us off. I thank the panel very much, and Jonathan, I'm looking forward to reading your book. I hope everyone else is. There's, I think, a limited number for sale here, and if you aren't one of the lucky few to get one, then It's available on Amazon. And it's here in the bookshops here.
We're trying to get it here.
Okay, so hopefully soon in Slamaskis as well, and all good bookstores. Okay, thank you very much, everyone.